There are 3 reasons that you do not need a 30-06 and 3 that you do, and I'm going to go over those in today's video. When it comes to the topic of power, there are a few conversations had that don't include the 30-06. Wait a second. What is that? There's a pig. I'm sure we're all well aware of how dangerous hogs can be, so let's see how much stopping power the 30-06 has compared to some other cartridges. I'm going to be shooting this Vital Zone with 5 different cartridges to see which one swings it the best. And based on the swing, I think it'll be pretty clear which one has the most stopping power. I think that every good test starts with the 22 LR, so that's what we're going to go ahead and do. I'm really interested to see if it has enough energy to actually swing that plate. I really couldn't tell if that plate even swung at all. So I think we better bump up the power level. Up next we got the 9mm. It's putting out a decent amount more energy than the 22 LR, so I think it'll have a chance of swinging that plate. The 9mm seemed to get a little bit more of a reaction, but I don't know if it would put a hog down right away. Let's step it up. And moving on up, we're moving to the 223. It's known to be pretty good medicine on hogs, so let's see how much it swings that plate. Well, we got a new crater on the steel, so I'd say that was pretty effective. I still think we could do a little better though. The last round before the 30-06 is a 7.62 by 39. It puts out quite a bit of energy and is known to be pretty potent on hogs, so let's see how much it swings that plate. From what I could tell out of the red dot, it looked like the AK swung that plate pretty good, but let's step it up to the 30-06. You'll never believe it, but we got another new crater right there, and it absolutely smacked that steel. And upon further investigation, it looks like if I shoot enough rounds, all of the shrapnel will actually cut the world in half. Just kidding, but it's getting pretty deep. Now let's go back and analyze those results. Although I think we already know who won. All right. We all knew that the 30-06 was going to win that competition, but the real story was how close it was between the 223 and the 7.62 by 39. If I hadn't known which order I shot those in on camera, I would have had a really tough time figuring out which was which. But anyways, I think that this test proved that the 30-06 has a lot of power. So you're just too good for factory loaded ammo, huh? Well, lucky for you, you can reload the 30-06 in just about any configuration you could possibly want. On the Hodgdon website, which is a great place to find free reloading data, especially if you don't have a book, they currently have 520 load recipes for the 30-06, including bullets ranging from 110 grain all the way up to 225 grain, and 39 different powder choices. 39 different powder choices. For a single cartridge, that is an insane number of powders. To put this into perspective on just how crazy it is to have 520 different load recipes, even super popular cartridges like the 6.5 Creedmoor only currently have 221 different load recipes, meaning that the 30-06 currently has almost 2.5 times the number of load recipes available. That is freaking mind-blowing to me. But that's needless to say, if not one single load of those 520 different loads suits your fancy, then I really can't help you out. I'm going to explain to you why the 30-06 might actually be the most versatile cartridge ever created. Because the 30-06 is a 30 caliber cartridge, or 308 in diameter, it's loaded up with a multitude of different bullets, ranging from ultra-light bullets like a 110 grain varmint or even a 55 grain sabot, and because of the large powder capacity of the 30-06, it's effectively able to run up to 225 grain or sometimes even heavier bullets at decent velocities. Which means that one single rifle can take the smallest animals like prairie dogs all the way up to the largest animals in North America like bison. Although it's really not the best cartridge for either of these extremes, but it has definitely been taken around the world to take every single game animal. When it comes to recoil, the 30-06 is known for being pretty stout, and I'm going to try and show this difference versus a 7mm Odd 8, which is the short action cartridge that also puts out a decent amount of energy. Well, that wasn't very convincing, now was it? Although it didn't appear to be that much of a difference, I promise that 30-06 had way more recoil than that 7mm Odd 8. And even still, I think we can all agree that the 30-06 should not be the first rifle that a child shoots. This next one's going to be a little bit controversial, but if you already have a 308 in your collection, do you really need a 30-06? I'm under the impression that you don't, and here's why. Now hold on just a second. Before you get mad and click off this video, if you're not shooting bullets above 165 grains, then the 308 and the 30-06 really aren't that different. In fact, the difference is usually only a maximum of 150 feet a second, unless you start talking about the really heavy bullets. And to show you just how little of a difference this is, I think we should test both of the calibers out on the Hog using the exact same ammo. Was it really that much of a difference? I don't know, you tell me, but I don't think that Hog noticed too much of a difference. And when you consider that there's usually a pretty decent price difference between the 308 and the 30-06, that difference on the Hog becomes even more negligible in my opinion. It's not until we start talking about heavier projectiles that the 30-06 actually starts to outshine the 308. So if we look at loads using the most efficient powder choices in each of these cartridges, the 308 with a 150 grain bullet will do about 3,000 feet a second, whereas the 30-06 will do about 3,100 feet a second. That's really not that big of a difference. And keep in mind that this is book data, not your super hot custom fancy loads. But anyways, with a 180 grain bullet, the 308 will do about 2650 feet a second, whereas the 30-06 will do about 2850 feet a second. That's a difference of 200 feet a second, which is pretty decent. Let's be honest, unless you start getting up into the 200 plus grain bullets, which the 30-06 really isn't the best with, 30 caliber ballistics kinda suck. At least compared to smaller diameter projectiles. Much like the 308, the 30-06 suffers from more drop and more wind drift than similar size cartridges with smaller diameter bores like the 280 Remington and the 6.5-06. But rather than talk about it, how's about we look at some charts to prove this point? This is going to be the ammo that I was referencing in these charts. All of them are loaded with interlock bullets, and it's as close to the same grain weight as I could find. So if we take a look at velocity, the 30-06 started at 3,000 feet a second, the 280 Remington started at 2,900 feet a second, and the 6.5-06 started at 2,800 feet a second. They all seem to meet the same point at 300 yards, and then start to open up from there. At 400 they're pretty close, at 500 they're still pretty close, but then they just keep opening up from there. And when we get to 1,000 yards, the 6.5-06 lost exactly half of its initial velocity, and it's at 1,399 feet a second. The 280 Remington's still doing pretty good at 1,282 feet a second, and the 30-06 is at 1,175. So even though the 30-06 had the highest muzzle velocity, it actually ended up being the lowest velocity at 1,000 yards by about 100 feet a second. Moving on to energy, this is where the cartridges really differ at the muzzle. The 30-06 started with 2,998 foot-pounds of energy, the 280 Remington started with 2,596 foot-pounds of energy, and the 6.5-06 started with 2,438 foot-pounds of energy. Looking through the numbers, the 30-06 is still the highest, out to about 500 yards, and then they all meet at the same point pretty much. But moving on from there, they all start to go their separate ways. Going on to 1,000 yards, the 6.5-06 is at 609 foot-pounds, the 280 Remington is at 508 foot-pounds, and the 30-06 is at 460 foot-pounds. So even though the 30-06 started at the highest muzzle energy by about a 400 foot-pound margin, the 6.5-06, which was the lowest muzzle energy, is actually beating it by about 150 foot-pounds at 1,000 yards. That's pretty nuts. And moving on to drops, surprisingly all of the cartridges are pretty consistent out to 700 yards, but after that they start to go their own separate ways. So the 6.5-06 ended up dropping 316 inches, the 280 Remington ended up dropping 328 inches, and the 30-06 ended up dropping 345 inches. That's a pretty big gap difference between each of those, but not as big as I was thinking. And moving on to wind drift, this is where 30 calibers really start to show their terrible ballistic coefficient. And with a 10-mile-an-hour wind drift, the cartridges are pretty consistent out to 300 yards, and maybe even 400 yards, but after that they start to go their own separate ways. At 1,000 yards, the 30-06 drifts 112 inches, the 280 Remington drifts 95.4 inches, and the 6.5-06 drifts 80.1 inches. This literally means that at 1,000 yards, the drift difference between the 30-06 and the 6.5-06 is over 2.5 feet. That's a pretty big target, but if you're not planning on shooting past 500 yards anyways, as we could see by these charts, you're really not getting any benefits from these smaller cartridges, and you're not getting this kind of muzzle energy. So there you go, there's 3 reasons why you need a 30-06 and 3 reasons why you don't. Personally, I'm a pretty big fan of the cartridge, but it's up to you to decide if you actually need it or not. Anyways, I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, don't let ballistics drive you bananas.